13 new most disturbing, true camping trail horror stories. The lantern that shouldn't be there. I'd been on the trail for a week, long enough that the woods had settled into a kind of predictable rhythm. Branches creaked in the same ways. My boots made the same steady thud against the dirt. Even the air felt familiar, like the forest had finally accepted me. By late afternoon, I started scanning for a flat patch of ground to make camp, thinking only about dinner and how early I'd be asleep. That was when I saw it, hanging from a low branch about 30 feet ahead. A lantern, not a modern one. Wooden frame, thick glass, metal rings, darkened with age, the kind you'd expect to find in an old photograph, not swaying gently in the middle of a restricted fire zone. At first I thought another hiker had left it there, maybe as a marker, but the flame inside didn't behave the way fire should. It burned tall and perfectly still, untouched by the breeze brushing through the pines around me. I stepped closer, and the forest seemed to hush itself, as if waiting. The lantern hung directly above a narrow trail, one that wasn't on my map, wasn't on any map I'd seen, and for a moment, I felt the strange pull of it, like the light was inviting me to step off the world I knew. The hiker had spent years exploring deep wilderness trails, confident in reading land and weather, but this route felt unusually empty. On his second night, he noticed a lantern swinging deeper in the trees, an old oil-burning kind that stood out sharply against the modern world. He assumed it belonged to a hunter or ranger until it appeared again the next night. This time closer, its flames steady and unnaturally bright. The forest seemed to quiet each time it glowed. By the third night, he woke to see the lantern only a few feet from his tent, its light illuminating footprints in the pine needles, footprints that circled his camp in irregular, shuffling patterns. When he tried following them at sunrise, they led to a sheer drop, with no sign of a person climbing up or down. As he pushed toward the trailhead, exhausted and paranoid, the lantern continued reappearing at random intervals, always ahead of him, always at eye level, as if guiding him somewhere he never intended to go. The final twist occurred when he checked his trail camera footage. Each appearance of the lantern included the brief silhouette of a hunched figure behind it, holding the handle with a broken wrist that bent in the wrong direction. A lone backpacker kept seeing an antique lantern hanging in the trees, first far away, then closer, then right outside his tent. Footprints appeared around his camp, but no person ever came forward. When he followed the trail, it ended at a cliff that no one could climb. But the real horrors surfaced later, captured on his trail camera, and the lantern wasn't hanging by itself. I'd been hiking alone through the Rainvale woods when the storm forced me to take shelter in an abandoned rental cabin, number 19, according to the peeling wooden sign. The place looked dead, its windows crusted with grime, its porch drowning in wet leaves. But as I stepped onto the deck, trying to shake the water from my jacket, I noticed something that made me freeze. A small face staring at me through the side window, pale, expressionless, a boy no older than 9. I called out, but he didn't move, not even to blink. When I walked to the window, the glass looked frosted from the inside and the boy's face was still pressed to it, but his breath didn't fog the pain. That was the moment I realized something was wrong with the cabin itself. The storm around me went silent, like the world was holding its breath. And just before I reached for the door, the boy's head tilted slowly, almost curious, like he was wondering why I'd finally come back. I set up camp just before dusk, right at the tree line overlooking Hollow Creek, where the wind always seemed to travel in tight circles. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional drip of melting frost, and by the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the cold had settled in deep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing the exact edge of my campsite. I lay still, telling myself it was a deer, but the steps were too heavy, too rhythmic. Whatever it walked in a perfect circle, never brushing against brush or branch, never changing pace. Then, on the fourth loop, it stopped right behind my tent. I could hear breathing, thick, damp, almost bubbling, and the fabric bowed inward, just slightly, like something was leaning close enough to listen. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a full minute of silence, the footsteps started again, continuing their precise circle until dawn. When I finally crawled out, shaken, the ground around my tent was disturbed, but not by footprints. Instead, a flawless ring of bare earth circled me as if something had dragged a finger through the soil all night long. I crossed Miller's Bridge just after sunset, the old wooden planks groaning under every step, the river below swollen and restless after days of rain. Halfway across, I heard someone whisper my name, soft, unsure, like they were trying not to be heard by anyone but me. I froze, listening. The voice came again, this time from directly beneath the bridge, rising through the gaps between the boards. It sounded like my brother, the same tone he used when we were kids and he wanted me to follow him somewhere I shouldn't. But my brother died 12 years ago. The whisper grew clearer, more urgent, repeating my name with a rhythm too steady to be human. Against every instinct, I crouched and pressed my ear to the wood. The voice shifted instantly, dropping to a low, broken mumble. My brother's last words from the hospital, recited exactly, down to the way his breath rattled at the end. The river surged, and something scraped along the underside of the planks, moving slowly toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran the rest of the way across, heart pounding so hard, I tasted blood. But when I reached the far side and looked back, the whisper drifted up once more, calm and patient, saying just 2 words I'll never forget. Come back. I was hiking the northern ridge when I found the cabin. Nothing more than a collapsed shell, swallowed by moss and winter rot. There were no footprints, no trail leading to it, no sign that anyone had stepped inside for decades. I only stopped to take a picture, but just as I raised my phone, a soft glow bloomed inside the ruins, like someone had lit a lantern in the center of the collapsed floor. The light pulsed once, then steadied into a warm, amber glow. I knew no one could be in there. Half the roof was gone, the doorway half buried. Yet the light grew brighter, spreading across the broken boards as if an unseen hand walked a lantern from corner to corner. Then came the faint creak of floorboards shifting under weight. Paced and slow, I backed away, breath held. The glow slid toward the doorway and paused, as though something had stopped just behind the threshold, listening to me breathe. A moment later, the light snapped out, leaving the cabin darker than before, as if it had stolen what little daylight remained. I didn't look back as I walked away, but halfway down the trail, the forest behind me flickered, just once, with the same warm glow, hanging in the trees like a lantern, searching for someone who had stepped out of reach. The sisters had chosen the loop trail because it was short, familiar, and supposedly straightforward, just 6 miles through the Tennessee woods. At first, it felt perfectly normal, Birds called overhead, the dirt under their boots smelled of damp pine, and the sun filtered through the canopy in soft gold. But within an hour, they noticed something that twisted their stomachs. Every bend, every fallen log, every scrape on a tree seemed identical. They passed a section of trail and then, minutes later, passed it again. Same markings, same fallen branch, same indentations in the dirt. Their compasses spun. The GPS flickered like a dying screen, and panic crept in as the loops repeated with impossible precision. By evening, faint voices began murmuring through the shadows, echoing fragments of their childhood, inside jokes, forgotten promises, names only they could know. One sister, desperate for any change, stepped off trail to check a ridge and vanished. The other ran until her legs ached, circling the same twisted path over and over until dawn revealed the horrifying truth. She was standing at the very spot she had started, with her sister's backpack resting neatly where hers should have been. She walked out alone, heart hammering, but weeks later, hikers reported seeing two figures moving hand in hand through the loop, smiling as if time had trapped them forever. I had set up camp just off the old pine trail, expecting the solitude to be comforting, but by nightfall, the forest had taken on an uneasy stillness. The fire flickered, and I thought I heard voices, low, murmured words that seemed to come from the shadows beyond the ring of my light. At first, I convinced myself it was the wind rustling through the trees, the way branches scraped against each other. But the murmurs grew more distinct, forming half-words, phrases I had never heard, yet somehow felt intimately familiar. They spoke in my name, calling out to me as if they had always known I would come. Every time I turned toward the sound, it stopped. When I finally crawled into my tent, convinced it was my imagination, the whispers followed me inside, soft but unmistakable, circling, pausing, then retreating to the darkness outside. I slept fitfully, waking to the crackle of leaves just beyond the firelight, and in the morning, my campsite showed no signs of intrusion, except a perfect circle of stones around the fire pit, carefully arranged in a pattern I could not remember making. The trail started innocently enough, a narrow path cutting through thick hemlocks, the ground soft with fallen needles. Two friends joked about the miles ahead, their voices bouncing off the trees, confident the hike would be uneventful. But soon, faint laughter began echoing through the forest, distant at first, almost playful, then growing sharper and closer, though no one else was on the trail. Every turn they took seemed to lead them past the same boulder, the same fallen tree, the same split log they had passed minutes before. The laughter began to imitate them, mocking their footsteps, copying their words. When one of them shouted into the clearing, the response came immediately, whispering their own name, repeating their questions with sinister precision. Darkness fell faster than it should have, and shadows between the trees seemed to twist and pulse in rhythm with the laughter. Panic set in as they realized the trail wasn't moving forward. It was folding back, circling them, herding them toward the source. By the time they ran blindly toward what they thought was the trailhead, the laughter vanished, leaving only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the unsettling certainty that the forest had learned how to mimic them, trapping them in its cruel loop. Footsteps beside the tent. They arrived at the campground with the kind of quiet excitement that comes from returning to a place that once mattered. 30 years had passed, yet the old forest road still bent the same way, curling through pines that now seemed taller and far more crowded than either of them remembered. The trees leaned inward over the clearing, their branches interlocking like a canopy that blocked more light than it should have. Still, the spot felt familiar enough to convince them they'd chosen the right place to spend a few days away from everything. They worked in practiced silence as they set up their tent, the motions smooth from a life of camping trips, but every so often one of them paused, listening to nothing in particular, just sensing that the air had a thickness to it, the sort that settles in places where noise doesn't quite behave. As dusk crept in, the colors drained from the woods quicker than expected. Shadows stretched between the tree trunks as if pulled by slow hands, and the breeze carried an odd chill that didn't match the temperature on their phones. It came in short, unnatural bursts, brushing the backs of their necks before disappearing entirely. There was no swaying of branches, no shifting of leaves, just a cold pressure that moved through the clearing without wind. They tried to laugh it off, convincing themselves it was merely evening settling in, the forest adjusting as night took over. But something in the silence felt arranged, like the pause between breaths. By the time they climbed into their sleeping bags, a stillness had settled over the campsite, thick enough to notice. No insects clicked. No birds fussed through the trees. Even the distant stream sounded muted, as though someone had packed the world in cotton. They drifted toward sleep, telling themselves it was nothing, that forests change, that memory exaggerates. Yet the quiet carried a weight they couldn't name, and the air outside felt as if it were waiting for them to let their guard down. They didn't see the shape that moved between the trees after they closed their eyes. They didn't hear the slow shift of pine needles as something stepped closer, testing the edges of the clearing. They slept, unaware that they were no longer alone, unaware of the presence that had already begun circling them before the night had even reached its darkest hour. They woke to the sound of something dragging through the leaves, slow, rhythmic, heavy enough to press into the soil. At first, they weren't sure what had pulled them from sleep. The night inside the tent felt thick, the kind of darkness that settles only when the moon is smothered behind clouds. Then the sound came again, closer this time, brushing the edge of the nylon like a fingertip tracing along fabric. They held still, listening as the footsteps circled their tent in a wide, deliberate arc. One slow loop, then another, and then a third, each pass tightening just a little, as though whatever moved out there was studying the shape of their shelter. They didn't speak. They barely breathed. The forest around them was too still, too expectant, as though it were listening alongside them. The husband counted each step under his breath, waiting for some sign that it was an animal, that the steady pacing meant something normal. But no deer walked with that slow, dragging rhythm. No person moved without the sound of clothing, brushing, or breath catching. And still, the steps kept circling, closing the distance like a tightening snare. On the fourth pass, the sound stopped completely, settling inches behind where the wife's head rested. The nylon dipped inward, ever so slightly, as if something leaned close from the outside. A tremble of cold air pressed through the fabric, warm at first, then turning into a shaky, uneven exhale. It was the kind of breath that came from something trying not to be heard, something patient, something aware of them. Neither of them dared move. The silence that followed felt unnatural, too sudden, like the woods themselves had pulled in air and refused to let it go. Minutes stretched into something longer, a waiting that grew heavier with each heartbeat. They stared at the tent ceiling, listening for any hint of retreat, but the quiet outside felt staged, deliberate, like the thing beyond the nylon was holding still, only because they were. When the night finally passed into dawn, it wasn't because the footsteps resumed. It was because the silence broke all at once, replaced by a distant bird call that sounded sharp and misplaced, as though even the forest was startled back into motion. By then, the presence outside had slipped away without a single returning step. Morning light crept through the tent fabric in thin, pale bands, and for a moment they allowed themselves to believe the night had exaggerated itself in their minds. But when they stepped outside, the clearing told a different story. The ground looked untouched. No bent grass, no disturbed earth, no trail of any kind. It was as though nothing had moved there at all. The air carried the same hush from the night before, a muted heaviness that seemed to swallow their footsteps as they walked the perimeter in slow, cautious loops. They expected at least some sign of an animal, a hoof print or a patch of scraped bark. Instead, they found nothing, except the strange stillness clinging to the forest like a second skin. Then the wife saw it, a smooth, pale stone resting at the exact center of their tent's entrance flap. It was too perfectly placed to be accidental, too clean to have rolled there on its own. She crouched beside it without touching, noticing the way it seemed to glow faintly in the morning light, as if it hadn't come from the forest floor at all. Her husband tried to turn the moment into something harmless. A hiker could have left it, or maybe it had always been there and they hadn't noticed. But his voice wavered, and the explanation fell flat in the heavy air. The woods around them felt hollow, stripped of echoes, as though the forest was drawing all sound inward and keeping it. They stood in the clearing longer than they meant to, listening for birds or wind or anything familiar, but the land remained unnervingly quiet. Even their whispers felt too loud, bouncing back at them in a way that made the trees seem closer than before. The stone sat untouched on the ground, small and ordinary, yet carrying a sense of intent that neither of them wanted to name. It didn't belong there. It had been placed. By evening, they had almost convinced themselves to leave, packing and unpacking small things as they debated whether they were overreacting. But as the sun dipped behind the tree line, the forest shifted again. The hush deepened, pressing against their ears like the muted pressure inside an airplane cabin. No wind stirred, no insects buzzed. The world around them tightened into a kind of alert stillness, one that didn't feel empty at all. The second night settled in, colder than the first, though the forecast had promised mild weather. The air carried a weight to it, thick and unmoving, like fog that never quite formed. Even inside the tent, they could feel it pressing down, as though the whole forest were holding its breath. They lay awake longer than usual, listening to the unnerving quiet outside. No rustle of wildlife, no scrape of branches, not even the distant rush of the creek they'd heard earlier that day. The silence grew so dense it felt physical, coating the inside of the tent like a thin layer of frost. Then the footsteps returned. They came without warning, placed softly this time, as if whatever walked outside had learned from the night before. Each step pressed deliberately into the pine needles, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. The sound moved at a slow, patient pace around the edge of the clearing, keeping just enough distance to avoid brushing the nylon. The couple tensed in their sleeping bags, unable to tell whether the pattern was the same or if the thing outside was tracing a new route. But the precision of each step, the unnatural care in every placement, felt unmistakably intentional. The sound stopped at their tent door. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the zipper twitched. Not enough to open, just a tiny testing pull, as though fingers had pinched the metal tab and tugged it upward a single inch. The faint slide of teeth separating broke through the silence like a whispered question. The husband reached out instinctively, gripping the zipper from the inside to hold it still. His hand met the cold metal just as something outside let go. The nylon quivered once, then went still again. The footsteps resumed after that, one slow step backward, then another, each unnervingly controlled, retreating into the leaves with impossible softness. They listened to the quiet spacing of the steps until they faded entirely, swallowed by the dense, breathless forest beyond the clearing. Neither of them dared speak. The air inside the tent felt too fragile, too thin, as if a single word might draw the thing back. They stayed, frozen in place, waiting for any sign of return, but the woods offered nothing except that oppressive, unnatural silence. It felt like the forest was pretending to sleep, and they knew it wasn't over. Morning came, reluctantly, as if the sun itself hesitated to cross into the clearing. When they unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the air felt brittle, carrying the faint metallic chill of something unsettled. They searched the ground again, slower this time, scanning every inch for prints or crushed pine needles. But the clearing looked untouched, pristine, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever walked there. Not the night before, not ever. The absence of evidence was somehow worse than finding tracks. It made the footsteps feel less like something physical and more like something that moved without needing the ground. As they walked the perimeter, they realized the silence had grown even deeper. No insects hummed in the grass, no birds called from the branches above. The forest felt emptied out, its usual rhythms hollowed away. It reminded them of the minutes before a storm. Only there was no storm, no pressure change, no reason for nature to hold itself so tightly. Even the air felt thin, as though the space around them had been scraped clean. They hiked during the day just to escape the clearing, moving along the familiar trails with the hope that distance would loosen the grip of whatever hung over their campsite. But the forest offered little comfort. The deeper they went, the more they noticed them, smooth, pale stones appearing along the path, one on a mossy log, another at the base of a cedar, a third tucked neatly into the crook of a tree root, as if someone had placed it there with careful hands. Each stone matched the one from their tent entrance exactly, the same color, the same texture, the same unsettling sense of intention. With every mile, the pattern tightened. Each stone seemed positioned closer to the trail's center, guiding them or warning them or marking something that wasn't meant to be marked. They didn't speak about it, but both felt the same quiet dread building, the understanding that they weren't stumbling into coincidence. Something had taken interest in them, something that didn't leave prints, didn't leave sound, didn't leave. By the time they returned to camp, evening had already begun to smother the sky. The clearing lay ahead like a held breath, waiting for them to step inside. Their tent looked exactly as they had left it, but the silence around it was thicker than before, almost expectant. They knew then that the circle was closing, and whatever had started following them wasn't anywhere near finished. Nightfall came faster than either of them expected, as if the sun had been pulled away rather than setting on its own. The air inside the clearing felt colder, heavier, the way a room feels after being shut for too long. They sat in their tent without speaking, each trying to pretend they weren't counting the seconds until the footsteps returned. But the forest didn't wait. The first sound came the moment the last traces of light slipped from the trees, a single step, placed too close to be accidental. Then another, and another, faster this time, circling the tent with a nervous, hungry energy that made the nylon walls tremble. The footsteps didn't wander the clearing like they had before. They moved with purpose, as if whatever walked out there no longer cared about being careful. The wife flinched when the fabric behind her head tightened, pulled inward by a pressure that felt unmistakably human. Something leaned close, close enough for its weight to press the tent floor seams into the dirt. Her breathing hitched, but before she could speak, the first whisper slid through the nylon. It was faint, barely a sound at all, just a thin exhale shaped into the outline of her name. The breath carried a coldness that didn't belong to the night, a chill that sank through the fabric, as though it had passed straight through whoever or whatever had made it. She clamped a hand over her mouth. The husband did the same without needing to be told. They froze, terrified that any sound they made would draw the whisper closer, but the whisper changed anyway. It came again, dragging along the nylon with a rasping edge, as if the voice was learning its own shape. The syllables wavered, stretching too long, like someone practicing a sound they'd heard, but never spoken. The breath brushed the fabric again, warm, then cold, and the rasp deepened into something that no longer resembled a human voice at all. The tent shuddered as the presence leaned harder against it, testing the boundary between inside and out. Then everything stopped. No steps, no breath, no whisper, just a silence so absolute it felt engineered, tight and hollow, like the forest had sealed itself shut around them. They didn't move, didn't dare breathe too deeply. The darkness pressed against the tent, as if listening, waiting for any sign of weakness. They lay awake until dawn, bodies shaking, afraid to close their eyes, because now they knew it wasn't just watching them, it wanted to speak to them, and it had learned her name. They didn't wait for sunrise. Long before the sky began to grey, they tore the tent stakes from the soil with shaking hands and packed only what they could grab. Their headlamps cut narrow tunnels of light through the darkness as they fled down the trail. But the forest seemed to swell and shrink around the beams, the trees leaning inward like they were watching the couple run. The air carried no morning chill, only a stale heaviness, as if the night refused to fully end. Every sound they made felt smothered. The crunch of dirt under their boots, the rapid breath between them, all swallowed before it could fade into the woods. But something behind them didn't stay quiet. Branches snapped in a slow, deliberate rhythm, keeping perfect pace with their steps. When they sped up, the snaps quickened. When they slowed, the sound shifted to match. It never came closer, never drifted far. It simply followed, a patient shadow, pacing their retreat through the maze of trees. The couple didn't dare turn around. They could feel something just beyond the edge of their lights, something that moved without effort, without strain, as though the forest itself carried it along. The trail twisted and dipped, but the presence moved smoothly, never missing a beat. Even the wildlife seemed to flee from the area ahead of them. No birds stirred, no small animals rustled in the brush. The woods had emptied out again, yet the sense of being watched had never been stronger. Every now and then, a faint puff of cold air brushed the back of the wife's neck, far too precise to be wind. Each time she stumbled, it felt as though the darkness behind them leaned in slightly, curious, almost eager. When they finally broke through the tree line and reached the gravel of the ranger access road, they stopped only long enough to catch their breath. Their headlamps swept the stretch of empty road, revealing nothing but dust and scattered stones. The snapping branches had stopped the moment they stepped out of the forest's shadow, ending with a final, distant crack that felt more like a signal than an accident. Then they saw it. A single smooth stone sat in the exact center of the road, resting where no stone should naturally be. Pale, clean, perfectly placed. The same as the ones left by their tent. The same as the ones they had followed through the forest without realizing it. They didn't touch it. They didn't speak. They simply kept walking, knowing the woods had let them go, but hadn't finished with them at all. Days passed. The kind of quiet that should have brought relief, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. They tried to settle back into their house, to return to the routines of suburban life, yet the memory of the forest clung to them like damp clothing. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows carried weight, made them jump, made them check the corners of the rooms. The world had shifted, leaving them aware of something they couldn't see, something that had learned to move in silence. Heavy steps echoed across the hallway, slow, deliberate, circling as though marking a path only it could understand. Each footfall pressed into the floor with a calculated patience, sounding both near and impossibly far, as if it existed somewhere between rooms, between moments. The air grew cold and carried the sharp, unmistakable scent of pine, dense and alive, like the forest had followed them here in pieces. A soft exhale brushed the bedroom door, cold against their skin, yet oddly warm in the way that breath from another being always feels. It lingered, waiting for them to wake, to notice, to respond. The wife stirred, eyes opening to the faint shadow of the hallway stretching toward them. At the foot of the bed, she noticed it, a smooth stone, pale and flawless, resting as though someone had placed it there while they slept. Her hand hovered over it, trembling, but the moment she touched nothing, shifted. The stone was inert, yet heavy with intention, and the memory of the footsteps, the whispering, and the forest pressed into her mind like a second heartbeat. They knew, without needing to speak, that it had followed them, that the boundaries of home no longer meant safety, that the forest, the stones, the unseen presence, whatever it was, did not stop at clearing edges or paved roads. And as the minutes stretched on, the exhale returned, soft, patient, waiting for them to make the next move, to acknowledge the presence that had never truly left. They did not move. They could not. The stone remained, and outside the walls of their familiar home, the forest seemed to breathe in tandem with it, patient, endless, and utterly watchful. The trail marker that moved. I returned to that stretch of the Colorado Alpine Trail, the way people return to old habits, quietly, without even thinking about it. After 3 years of hiking and photographing that area, the path felt as familiar as the lines on my own hands. The morning had started normally enough. Thin, cold air pooling in the low places, the faint scatter of animals waking in the underbrush, the forest stretching into daylight with the slow confidence it always had. I wasn't expecting anything strange. I wasn't even looking for it. But when I reached the section of trail that overlooked a shallow ravine, something bright pulled at the corner of my eye. A fresh orange trail marker was nailed to a spruce tree that had never held one before. At first I just stared, trying to make sense of it. The official markers out here were old. Rusted edges, fading arrows, bent nails barely holding them up. This one looked like it had been put there minutes ago. The metal plate was clean, almost polished. The nail was straight, silver, and new, and the arrow pointed directly into the ravine. A direction no trail had ever gone. I stood there in the settling quiet, trying to convince myself it was just a mistake. Maybe a volunteer, hiking through and misplacing gear. But the forest around the ravine felt wrong. There was no wind in the pines. No usual bird calls drifting overhead. Just stillness wide and heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept hiking, pretending it didn't bother me, but the thought followed me up the trail. Why there? Why new? And why hadn't I heard anyone hammering it in? By the time I reached my campsite and set my tent, beneath a cluster of pines, the sun had dropped behind the ridge, and the wind finally returned in long, uneven gusts. I tried to fall back into routine, sorting lenses, planning sunrise shots, cooking quietly over my small stove, but every tap of wind against my tent made me think of that bright metal plate shifting against its nail. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I told myself I'd check it again in the morning. But lying there in the dark, listening to the wind fade and return in slow breaths, I couldn't shake one last thought. If that marker was new, someone had put it there, and I should have heard them. Morning came colder than I expected, the kind of cold that settles into the bones of the forest before the sun has a chance to push it out. I unzipped my tent, expecting the same quiet stretch of trees I'd camped beside the night before. Unchanged, untouched. Instead, the first thing I saw was orange. A trail marker hung on the tree less than 10 feet from my tent. The same clean metal plate, the same new nail, the same arrow pointing toward the ravine miles behind me. For a long moment, I just stared at it, confused enough that my mind tried to rearrange the past 24 hours. I'd camped far from where I'd seen the original marker. There had been no night footsteps around my tent, no beam of a headlamp slipping between the trees, no sign of anyone wandering near my campsite at all. But someone had been here. The bark around the nail bore fresh scrapes, the kind left by tools pressed hard into wood. The ground below was disturbed, but not in any way I recognized. No defined boot prints, no animal tracks, just long, smooth drag marks that curved irregularly, as if something had moved without lifting its weight fully off the ground. I didn't touch the marker. I didn't want to. Instead, I stepped back and let the forest settle around me, listening for any clue the morning wind might carry. But the pines only creaked softly, and even that sound felt muted, like the air was swallowing everything before it could reach my ears. The sun climbed higher, but the unease clung like frost. I packed my gear slowly, checking over my shoulder more times than I'd admit. That marker made no sense. It couldn't have followed me, yet there it was, closer, deliberate, waiting. As I tightened the last strap on my pack, the forest darkened slightly, though no clouds passed overhead. It felt as if something unseen had shifted between the trees, settling into watch. And as dusk crept in earlier than it should have, I felt it more than heard it, that quiet, steady sense of being observed by something that didn't bother to hide. I didn't sleep deeply that night. The forest felt too alert, too aware of me, as if every shift in the wind carried some slow, deliberate intention. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound so subtle I couldn't tell if it had slipped into my dream first, or if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. A faint tapping, soft, rhythmic, metal striking wood in slow, patient intervals. At first I lay still, trying to convince myself it was just a loose branch shifting in the breeze, but the steadiness of it kept erasing that explanation. There was no randomness to the cadence. It was purposeful, measured. The kind of tapping someone makes when they aren't in a hurry, when the act itself is the point. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and swept my flashlight across the tree line. The beam moved between pines, catching nothing but rough bark and shifting needles. The forest didn't stir. Even the usual rustles of life seemed to have paused to listen. But the tapping didn't stop. It came from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light, from a place where trunks merged into a denser darkness. I stepped out only far enough to brace myself, breath clouding in the cold air. The tapping slowed, like whoever, or whatever, was making it had become aware of me listening. Then, without warning, it halted altogether. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It landed like a weight, pressing on the space around me until the night felt hollowed out. I stayed awake until the first pale light pushed through the branches. When I finally stepped out of my tent, the cold hit me first, then the shape of something bright to my right. Another marker. This one nailed directly into the tree beside my tent door, close enough that I could have reached it without taking a step. The metal plate still glistened with moisture from the night. The nail looked freshly set, and though nothing moved around me, I felt an overwhelming certainty that I hadn't slept as alone as I thought. By morning, whatever fear I'd felt in the dark had hardened into something sharper, something closer to anger. I'd hiked these trails for years without ever feeling watched, and now something was following me, inch by inch, tree by tree, leaving a trail of markers like breadcrumbs meant for someone who never asked for them. I broke camp quickly and started downhill, following the newest marker without letting myself think too long about why. The forest felt colder the deeper I went, the air growing heavier as if the elevation had suddenly doubled. The trail narrowed as it descended, folding in on itself until I realized I was entering a ravine I had never seen on any map, never noticed in all my time exploring this area. Yet the markers guided me, with a kind of quiet insistence, each one nailed freshly into a trunk or wedged cleanly into a dead stump. I checked one as I passed. It was cold, the metal biting at my fingertips like it had been placed only minutes earlier. The silence thickened the farther I walked. No wind, no insects, not even the distant calls of birds moving across the tree line. It was as if the forest's lungs had paused, waiting, listening. I tried turning back once, just to see if the trail behind me looked as familiar as it should, and for a moment I couldn't tell where I'd come from. The ravine walls bent the world inward, narrowing my view to a thin corridor of stone and shadow. The markers ahead gleamed faintly in the half-light, bright enough to keep pulling me forward. Each step echoed differently too, less like leaf litter and more like hollow ground, as if the earth beneath me had been scooped out long ago. When I paused to catch my breath, The quiet wrapped around me so tightly that even the sound of my own heartbeat felt intrusive. The forest wasn't just silent now, it felt expectant, as though it had been waiting for me to reach this place. And when I finally saw the next marker, a glint of orange deeper in the narrowing path, I realized I wasn't following a trail. I was walking into something's territory. The ravine eventually widened, almost abruptly, as if the forest had opened a single hidden hand just for me. I stepped into a clearing I didn't remember from any hike, though I'd walked this region more times than I could count. The ground was uneven, scraped bare in long arcs, like something had dragged across it for years. Then the glint of metal caught my eye. One piece at first, then another, then dozens scattered like debris after a storm. Trail markers, hundreds of them. Some lay twisted and bent, the kind of damage that doesn't come from weather, but from force. Something pulling them free with an intensity no human should have. Others were splintered, still attached to chunks of the tree trunks they once belonged to. And they didn't look old either. Some were rusted, yes, but others looked as new as the one I'd seen outside my tent that morning. It was like stepping into a graveyard of directions, every arrow pointing nowhere, every nail torn violently from its rightful place. I walked further in, slowly, listening to the way my boots crunched softly over the metal. In the center of the clearing sat a collapsed pile of gear, a backpack slumped sideways, a tripod half buried in dirt, a camera bag with one strap torn clean through. The sight hit me in a way the markers hadn't. The equipment wasn't random. It was familiar. Too familiar. I knelt beside the pack, my breath catching as I brushed soil off a lens cap. I recognized the tiny scratches on its surface, the ones I'd made when I'd dropped my own camera against a granite ledge 2 summers ago. My chest tightened as I lifted the bag. The zipper half opened exactly the way I left mine most days. The gear wasn't just similar, it was identical, every detail, every imperfection. It was as if someone had taken my pack, emptied it here, and let time bury it. But mine was still on my shoulder, still zipped, still full. For the first time, the air felt wrong inside my lungs, like the clearing itself was leaning closer, waiting for me to understand something I wasn't ready to face. The silence deepened in a way that reminded me of breath held too long, and the forest around me felt suddenly crowded, though I couldn't see anyone. Standing there, with my own gear reflected back at me, I realized the markers weren't leading me to a place. They were leading me to a pattern, one that had been repeating long before I arrived. I was still kneeling over the collapsed pack when the first tap reached me, so soft I almost mistook it for the settling of old wood. But then it came again, and again, slow, steady, measured. The same rhythm I'd heard outside my tent in the dark, only now it was closer, impossibly close. I turned toward the edge of the clearing, every muscle tightening without permission. The trees stood in rows of shadow, and for a moment, nothing moved. Then, just beyond the nearest trunk, I saw the faintest quiver of orange, a fresh trail marker, and next to it, a hand, pale, dirt-streaked fingers gripping a hammer, the way someone might hold something they don't fully understand. The figure stepped into view with a stiffness that looked almost borrowed. The jacket it wore stopped me cold, torn in the same place mine was torn, the sleeve frayed exactly where I'd snagged it on barbed wire last fall. The stains were the same. The pattern of dirt was the same. Even the way the hem, curled outward, matched the shape of my own. My throat tightened as the figure lifted its head, slow enough, that I could hear the faint drag of fabric. The face that emerged from the shadows was my own. Not just similar, perfectly mirrored, down to the faint scar across my eyebrow and the wind-burned flush from the morning hike. But the eyes, they didn't hold anything. No recognition, no breath behind them, just a vacant, waiting stillness. It lowered the hammer to its side, the metal glinting like an invitation. Then it tilted its head in a way that didn't feel human, a slow, deliberate angle, as if measuring how much fear it could draw out of me in one movement. I didn't step back. I couldn't. The forest around us went completely silent again, pressing in until I could hear my own pulse, louder than the wind. The figure didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It just watched me, my own face hollowed out and held up like something wearing a mask it hadn't fully grown into. And when it finally moved, it wasn't toward me. It pointed the hammer deeper into the woods, its arm lifting with a rigid marionette-like jerk. A direction, a command, a continuation of a trail I never asked to follow. Somewhere far behind it, another tap echoed faintly, another marker being placed, someone or something laying out the next step. And all I could think was, I wasn't the first person it had copied. The figure stepped toward me with the slow certainty of something that had already decided what I was supposed to do. Its movements weren't fluid. They were imitations, stiff and unfinished, like it had watched people walk and tried to copy the rhythm without understanding the purpose. Every shift of its weight made the fabric of the jacket crease in familiar ways, the same ways mine did, but the body beneath it didn't match the motion. The proportions were wrong somehow, stretched in places, slack in others, as if something inside was still settling into a shape it wasn't meant to wear. It tapped the hammer lightly against its thigh, not aggressively, not threatening, more like a reminder, a signal, a quiet insistence that the trail wasn't done with me yet. I stepped back instinctively, and the clearing seemed to respond, widening or maybe just feeling wider, as if the trees themselves had drawn away from the edges, giving whatever this thing was more room to approach. Shh. Breath sounded too loud in the silence. Even the air felt altered, thick enough that inhaling made my chest ache. The figure tilted its head again, that same unnatural angle from before, but this time there was a suggestion of curiosity behind it, or confusion, or something pretending to feel those things. It pointed the hammer once more into the dark line of the trees behind it, and for a moment I almost believed there might be a trail hidden there, some path I had overlooked all these years. But then I remembered the markers scattered across the clearing, the torn ones, the bent ones, the ones ripped out violently from places I'd probably walked right past. These weren't guides, they were instructions, replacements, a system repeating itself over and over until it got the result it wanted. A shape of me, a version of me. As I kept backing away, the clearing seemed to shift beneath my feet, like the ground was subtly tilting or breathing. The edges of the forest bent inward, swallowing small sounds, trapping larger ones, and all the while, the figure watched me with my own empty face, waiting for me to understand the part I was supposed to play. I don't know how long I stood there, my pulse hammering in my ears and the cold gnawing up my spine, but I knew, deep down, deeper than fear, that whatever waited deeper in the woods wasn't new. It had been here long before me, long before the last person it copied. And now that it had my face, it wasn't going to let me leave with it. The camera in my pack clicked before I even reached for it. At first, I thought it was my trembling hands pressing the shutter, but the weight in my backpack hadn't shifted. I froze, listening, and realized the clicks came in steady, deliberate intervals, echoing faintly across the clearing. My eyes darted between the trees, and then I saw them. Dozens of figures, older copies, unfinished versions of myself, some missing features, some only half-formed, peeking from between trunks and shadowed gaps. The forest felt alive in a way it never had, like it was watching me with all of them at once, measuring which version to keep, which to let go. My heartbeat thudded too loudly, yet none of them moved in the way a living creature would. The one wearing my face stepped forward, holding the camera I had just seen clicking, raising it slightly as if documenting me instead. My throat tightened, the wind stilled, and the clearing seemed to stretch and shrink at once, disorienting me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the earth, my mind struggling to make sense of what the forest had already decided. The tapping came again, soft, metallic, measured, this time from behind me, echoing the rhythm of a nail striking wood. And just like that, it was impossible to know where I ended and where the copies began, whether I was being observed, replaced, or erased entirely. The forest held its breath, and I knew it had no intention of telling me the difference. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, hammer tapping lightly, drawing closer with every heartbeat, and I realized the forest was keeping something or someone, and it had chosen that night to remind me how easily it could decide which one belonged. The night the forest spoke. I started the hike the way I'd rehearsed it for weeks. Steady pace, light pack, and a printed map folded neatly in my breast pocket. The trail cut into the rainforest like a narrow scar, winding between old-growth trunks that leaned over the path as if studying whoever passed beneath them. Morning fog clung low to the ground, hanging between the ferns in pale curtains that stirred around my ankles with every step. For the first hour, everything felt normal, predictable, even comforting. The air had that cool, damp weight only the Pacific Northwest could create, and the soil carried the earthy smell of cedar and rain-soaked decay. My boot prints sank softly into it, leaving small depressions that filled instantly with dark water. But as the sun climbed, the wind began to move through the canopy in a strange, deliberate pattern. Not random gusts, not the gentle sway I expected from such tall trees. It came in pulses, 3 soft pushes, a pause, then 2 longer ones, as if the forest was trying to speak in a language I should have known. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of uneven terrain funneling air uphill. But the rhythm returned again and again, matching my steps until I found myself slowing without meaning to. The first trail marker appeared not long after, a thin red ribbon tied around a branch, bright against the deep green moss. I didn't remember that one being on the map. The route was supposed to be unmarked for the first few miles, aside from the carved wooden signs at the trailhead. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe another hiker had passed through recently and left their own guides. Then I spotted the second ribbon, then the third. Each one precisely the same height, off the ground, tied with the same tight double knot. None of them looked weathered or frayed. They could have been tied minutes before I arrived. The deeper I walked, the more I felt as if the trail was rearranging itself around me. Familiar bends appeared too early. Fallen logs I expected to climb over were suddenly nowhere in sight. Even the slope felt wrong, steeper in places, where the map showed a gentle incline. Every few minutes I'd stop, look around, and realize I didn't quite recognize the patch of forest I was standing in, even though I was following the path exactly. At one point, I turned to look behind me. My own boot prints were there, but they seemed lighter now, as if the forest was slowly lifting them out of the mud. I kept moving, telling myself that I just needed to get to my planned campsite before dusk. Only a few more miles, a few more hours, nothing to worry about. But the unease clung to me like humidity. The echo came next. It started when I stepped across a shallow creek, the water barely ankle deep. My boot splashed, and from somewhere deeper in the trees, the exact sound repeated. Same speed, same tone, same little ripple of water. Only I hadn't seen another creek nearby. I paused, lifted my foot, and let it fall again. Splash. And somewhere in the forest, a second splash answered. Closer this time. It stopped as soon as I held still. By the time I reached the small clearing where I planned to make camp, the sun had already begun sinking behind the ridgeline. I set down my pack, relieved to be done hiking for the day, and started pitching the tent. The forest around me had gone strangely quiet, not silent, but hushed, like a crowd holding its breath after someone asks a dangerous question. When the last stake was in the ground, I crouched beside the fire ring left by previous campers and struck a match. The flame flared, then guttered as a breeze wound through the clearing in those same deliberate pulses. 3 soft pushes, then 2 longer ones. The flame leaned with each gust, as if bowing to something moving through the trees. I finished my meal quickly, restless, checking in the perimeter more often than necessary. The ribbons were gone now, no bright flashes of red anywhere around the clearing. I didn't remember passing the last one. By full dark, the forest had settled into a deep, heavy stillness. I crawled into the tent, zipped myself in, and lay on my back, listening to the distant drip of water falling from high branches. That was when I heard it, a faint murmur, threading through the moss just beyond the fabric wall. Too low to be words, too soft to be wind. I held my breath. The murmur stopped, then started again, slightly closer, as if something out there had realized I was listening. I woke before sunrise, long before my alarm, with the sense that something had brushed against the side of my tent during the night. The air inside was cold enough to sting my throat when I breathed, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I'd actually slept or only drifted in and out of shallow dreams. Outside, the forest felt heavier than it had the night before. Every fern seemed weighed down, every branch drooping toward the earth, as if exhausted by whatever moved through the woods after dark. I stepped out into the stillness, stretched, and tried to shake off the stiffness, telling myself I just needed food and movement. But when I reached the edge of the clearing, the same low murmur from the night before floated up from somewhere beyond the ferns. Quiet, rhythmic, almost conversational. At first it sounded like hikers far down the ridge, the kind of indistinct chatter that carries strangely across valleys. I waited for it to fade or shift or break apart into normal forest noise, but the murmurs held steady, weaving around each other like overlapping threads. When I stepped toward the sound, it stopped instantly, as if someone far away had pressed their palm over a mouth. The forest fell silent. Even the air felt still. I took another cautious step, but nothing stirred. The moment I turned away and began walking back toward my tent, the murmuring returned, soft at first, then layered, following me from a distance just barely out of view. I forced myself to continue packing, pretending not to notice how the sound rose whenever I moved and fell into silence the moment I paused. It felt like being watched by people trying very hard not to be caught. At one point, I deliberately snapped a twig underfoot. The murmurs cut off mid-breath. Then slowly, they started again, closer now, as if whoever or whatever made them was adjusting to me. By midday, the forest had begun reacting in a way I couldn't rationalize. Every time I stopped to rest or sip water, the woods held absolutely still. No rustling, no birds, no breeze, as if the entire world were pausing to listen. But the second I continued walking, the voices returned, always behind me, always too soft to make out individual words. I tried to drown them out with my own thoughts, humming under my breath, dragging my boots noisily through gravel. It didn't work. The murmurs simply threaded themselves between the noises I made, weaving in and out of them like they were trying to form a pattern I refused to acknowledge. By late afternoon, the unease had sunk deep into my spine. I set up camp earlier than planned, hoping I could get off my feet before the sun dipped fully behind the ridge. The moment I zipped myself inside the tent, the forest quieted again. The same expectant hush from the previous night returned, thick and oppressive. I lay there in the dim light, listening to my own breathing and trying to believe this was just isolation working on my nerves. But sometime just before dawn, when the forest was still and the cold crept deepest into the ground, the murmurs returned one last time. Not a collection of soft threads, not layered, not distant. A single clear voice rose out of the darkness and shaped itself into a sentence. The tone was flat, breathless, almost rushed, as though someone had leaned close to the tent and whispered through clenched teeth. I couldn't understand the words, but the cadence, the urgency, the familiarity of the sound chilled every inch of me. And long after the whisper faded, long after sunrise began tinting the edges of the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to tell me something it was struggling to say clearly. By the third night, exhaustion weighed on me heavier than my pack. My legs trembled whenever I stopped walking, and my thoughts felt slow, stretched thin like old tape. But I kept moving, trying to outrun the whisper that had slipped so close to the tent before dawn. I told myself that if I just put enough miles behind me, the sounds would fade into memory, the way dreams do when sunlight finally burns them away. Instead, the forest grew stranger with every step. The air hummed with a pressure I couldn't explain, as though the woods were holding an echo before it had even been made. By late evening, when I finally reached another flat stretch of ground, the forest was already dimming into bluish dusk, the hour when shapes lose their boundaries and the familiar becomes blurred. I set up camp quickly, my hands unsteady, and tried to distract myself by boiling water for a meal I never finished. The trees around the clearing loomed taller here, close enough that their branches interlocked above me like ribs forming a cage. When darkness settled fully, it happened in a way that felt abrupt, unnatural, as if someone had drawn curtains between the trees. That was when the voices returned. Not murmurs, not drifting threads. Voices, dozens of them. They rose in different pitches, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to isolate a single source. Some sounded far away, muffled by layers of moss and thick bark. Others came sharp and sudden, like someone speaking from just behind a tree trunk. They didn't sound like hikers. They didn't sound like anything alive in those woods. I tried to convince myself it was echo, sound bouncing strangely through the canyon. But certain voices carried a tone I recognized all too well, pleading, argumentative, frantic. Some gasped in short bursts, as though buried under soil. Others whispered in broken syllables, voices so thin they seemed to float up from roots beneath the forest floor. The conversations overlapped, tangled, but none of them sounded unaware of me. It felt more like the woods had become a hallway, lined with rooms, each filled with someone calling out through a closed door. The more I listened, the more one chilling detail sank in. Not a single voice was unified in intention. Some begged me to leave, some begged me not to, some warned me to stay absolutely still. Others whispered that something had been following me since the first day. And then came the footsteps. They started softly, pacing along the outer edge of the clearing, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my pulse thud against my ribs. The sound circled the entire perimeter of my tent, never stumbling, never brushing against undergrowth, never breaking a twig. Whatever moved out there knew exactly where to place each step. I held my breath, listening to the steady rhythm as it drifted across one side of the clearing, then paused, then resumed on the opposite side, as if the figure had crossed through the center without displacing a single leaf. My throat tightened. The air in the tent felt too thin, too stale, as though something outside was drawing in the oxygen through incredibly shallow breaths. When the footsteps stopped right beside me, close enough that I could feel the cold through the nylon, I froze. A whisper slid against the tent wall, closer than any voice had come before. It sounded like someone speaking through damp fabric, the words forming too softly to decipher, but unmistakably meant for me. I didn't understand the sentence. I didn't need to. The tone alone carried a simple message that hollowed me out from the inside. I wasn't meant to be here. I wasn't supposed to be alone. And whatever had been wandering these woods long before I arrived had finally noticed that I was listening. I woke with the sensation that I had been watched all night, even though I couldn't remember a single dream or sound. My body felt heavy, drained in a way that didn't match the few hours of restless sleep. The forest around me seemed brighter than usual, but not in a comforting way. More like the light was too thin, too pale, barely clinging to the branches as if it didn't want to stay. I forced myself to pack, all the while aware of the strange quiet. Not peaceful quiet, expectant quiet. The kind that follows after someone whispers your name in a dark room and you're waiting to hear if they say it again. By mid-morning, the memory of the voices circling the campsite had settled into a dull ache behind my ribs. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been trying to get closer to me each night, adjusting itself in small, deliberate shifts. So before I continued down the trail, I pulled out my recorder, just a simple handheld device, and pressed the red button. I let it run as I walked, hoping the voices I'd heard weren't only in my head. Part of me needed proof. Part of me hoped for silence. When I played the recording back an hour later, sitting on a fallen log with sweat chilling between my shoulder blades, the speaker emitted nothing except the ordinary static of blank audio. No voices, no footsteps, not even the ambient rustle of wind. It was as if the recorder had been buried in sand the entire time. The whispers began again that afternoon, faint at first, drifting toward me in thin strands from between the pines. But this time, they didn't sound random. They didn't sound like lost hikers or distant echoes. They sounded aware. Their cadence shifted whenever I paused, as if they were learning the shape of my breathing, the rhythm of my footsteps. The longer I walked, the clearer they became. Individual tones rose out of the background, sharp ones, trembling ones, ones that carried an almost human sigh. I tried not to meet their attention with my own, but the forest didn't give me that choice. I saw movement in the distance, dark, narrow forms standing between the trunks, spaced evenly like silhouettes arranged with purpose. They didn't move, not an inch, not even when the wind swayed the branches around them. They were too tall to be hikers, too thin to be animals, too still to be anything living. At first, I thought they were trees I hadn't noticed, but trees don't shift positions when you blink. Each time I glanced away and back again, the figures seemed to stand in new places, always maintaining the same unnatural stillness. I quickened my pace, refusing to let myself stare for more than a second, but the sense of being observed tightened around me. The whispers accompanied every step, trailing just behind my ears as if the entire forest had leaned in. By twilight, the world had turned dim and washed out, the sky bleeding into a bruised violet. Shadows pooled between the roots. Mist coiled low across the ground. I felt the shift before I heard it. The moment when one voice separated itself from the layered murmur. It rose in a clear line, cutting through the others with an unmistakable intention. The trees seemed to press closer as the voice sharpened, solidifying into something far too familiar. For a heartbeat, I believed the forest had somehow found my memory and mimicked it perfectly, because the voice didn't drift like the others. It didn't plead or gasp or warn. It spoke my name, not distorted, not distant. Exact my full name, delivered from somewhere just beyond the tree line, in a tone that matched the voice I had carried inside my head since childhood. And in that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding since the first whisper. The forest wasn't just trying to reach me. It had been listening, learning, practicing, and now it knew exactly who I was. I don't remember deciding to stop walking. My body just froze the moment my name echoed through the trees, as if the sound had reached inside me and tightened every muscle at once. The forest held perfectly still, waiting for what I would do next. Even the mist seemed to pause mid-curl around the roots. I stood there in the half-light, unable to tell whether the cold creeping along my spine came from outside or from the voice itself. It hadn't sounded threatening or angry. It sounded almost patient, like someone who had been trying to get my attention for a very long time. The wind picked up again, but not in a natural way. The branches shifted in unison, each one bending at the same time, as though responding to a silent signal passed between them. The movement synced up with the cadence of the voice that had called my name, each pulse of air matching the slow rise and fall of syllables I couldn't quite decipher. I felt watched from every direction, not stared at, observed, studied, as if dozens of eyes were hidden between the trunks, waiting for me to make a single wrong move. The voice rose again, closer this time, slipping through the air with a strange steadiness. I couldn't catch every word, but I felt the meaning settle deep into my chest, as clear as if it had been whispered directly into my ear. Do not run. The forest seemed to lean in at that exact moment, every tree, every branch, every shadow. The pressure in the air thickened until breathing felt like dragging cold mud into my lungs. Something shifted behind me, something bigger than the figures I'd glimpsed between the trunks earlier. I didn't turn, I couldn't. The weight of the unseen thing following me pressed against my back like the heat from an animal's breath. Though the air around me was icy, the voice continued its low, steady warnings, repeating the same message in different tones, as if multiple speakers were taking turns saying it. Don't run. Don't draw attention. Don't let them notice you. I didn't know who they were. I didn't want to find out. My pulse hammered so loudly, it felt like the entire forest must have heard it. I tried to stay still, but my hands shook uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to put distance between myself and the shadow that seemed to be leaning over my shoulder. Then, from somewhere directly in front of me, another branch shifted. Not from wind. There was no wind now. The branch moved like something had brushed along it, intentionally, sliding bark against bark in a slow, dragging motion. The figures I'd seen earlier had vanished from their places between the trees, but the feeling of being surrounded hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified. Finally, I forced myself to turn my head, just enough to see the gap between two dark trunks. Something stood there, tall, still, and unmistakably aware of me. Its outline was wrong, too straight and too narrow, as though it were built from shadows instead of flesh. Even from that distance, I felt it watching me with a focus so sharp it made my skin prickle. I couldn't see its face. I wasn't sure it had one, but I felt the intent pouring off it in slow, patient waves. We stared at each other, or rather I stared at the space where its eyes should have been, until the forest exhaled around us in that precise, unnatural rhythm I had been hearing for days. In that moment, the truth settled in with a certainty that hollowed out my chest. Whatever stood between the trunks wasn't the source of the voice. It was something else, something listening to the voice just as I was. Something reacting to it. The warning repeated one final time, closer than ever, spoken in a tone that felt like a breath against my neck. Do not run, but I felt the forest tightening around me like a closing fist, and every instinct I had left told me that whatever waited in the shadows didn't want me to heed that warning, because it wanted me to stay exactly where I was. I didn't run at first. I told myself I wouldn't. But something shifted in the trees, a subtle rearranging of weight, a soft drag of something heavy passing over damp needles, and my resolve cracked. Every instinct in my body surged at once, pulling me backward before I could think. The forest exhaled sharply around me as if startled by the sudden movement. Then I ran. I tore through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face, ferns snapping under my boots. The moment I bolted, the voices behind me erupted, not in words I understood, but in frantic, overlapping cries that rose like distant alarms. Some begged me to stop, their tones sharp with panic. Others screamed that I was going the wrong way, their voices raw, urgent. They weren't unified anymore. They weren't even coherent. They sounded like dozens of people shouting at me from different corners of a collapsing room. The forest reacted instantly. Something massive moved parallel to me, keeping perfect pace on my right side. I couldn't see it through the dense trees, but I felt its presence with every stride, felt the deep vibration of its weight in the ground, felt the rhythm of its movement syncing with my own. Each time I veered left, the thing drifted closer, as if steering me back onto some invisible path. The air grew colder the faster I ran, burning in my lungs with each breath. The smell of wet soil sharpened, tinged with something metallic, something old, like rusted iron, buried just beneath the moss. I risked a glance sideways once, just once, and even in the blur of motion, I caught a glimpse of a dark silhouette sliding between the trees. Tall, impossibly tall, gliding rather than running, its form flickering in and out of view like a shadow, passing behind flickering light. It wasn't chasing me, it was escorting me, matching my speed with effortless precision. The voices behind me rose even louder, layering over each other until they dissolved into something like static, made from breath and panic. They weren't just following, they were gaining on me. Some voices screamed warnings. Some pleaded for help. A few sounded as if they were being dragged across the ground, their words stuttering with impacts I couldn't see. But one voice, one quiet, tremoring voice, kept repeating the same thing over and over, each time more desperate than the last. Stop before the light. Stop before the light. Stop before the... I didn't let it finish. I pushed harder, stumbling over slick roots and clawing through underbrush that felt like hands grabbing at my clothes. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with every step, as if the entire forest had started moving, closing in, reshaping itself to funnel me deeper into its throat. My legs shook violently, threatening to collapse beneath me. Still, I kept running, driven by nothing more than primal fear and the sense that something enormous was closing in behind me, inhaling the air I left behind. The trees thinned all at once. No warning, no gradual opening. The dense canopy simply broke apart, and pale dawn light spilled ahead like a chalk line drawn across the ground. My eyes struggled to adjust after so much shadow. The ridge beyond the thinning trees glowed faintly with early morning, a soft blue that looked impossibly far away and somehow too close at the same time. That small glow was the only thing that resembled safety, the only sign of something familiar in a world that had twisted itself into something I no longer recognized. Behind me, the forest erupted into one final chorus. Voices screaming, pleading, snarling, begging in languages I didn't recognize, as if the entire wilderness realized what I was about to step into. The massive presence, on my right, veered sharply inward, closing the distance between us until I felt the cold radiating off it like a shadow, trying to wrap itself around my ribs. The chorus rose in a single, shattering warning that cut through the air like a blade. But I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the light. The moment my boots broke out of the tree line, the world changed. It was like stepping from a room full of shouting into one held underwater. Every sound collapsed into a single, suffocating quiet. My ears rang from the sudden absence of voices. My lungs felt too large in my chest, too empty without the pressure of the forest breathing around me. Dawn had only just begun to lighten the gravel pullout, tinting everything a muted silver blue. The air outside the woods felt different, thinner, cleaner, but my body refused to believe I was safe. I kept running until the soles of my boots skidded on loose stone, forcing me to stop just inches from the drop-off at the edge of the lot. I turned back toward the tree line, expecting to see movement. Shadows slipping between trunks, the tall figure that had kept pace with me, something giving shape to the terror that had chased me through miles of undergrowth. But nothing emerged. The forest looked unchanged, untouched, as quiet and blank as any postcard of the Pacific Northwest. No movement, no sound, no evidence that anything had followed me. The branches hung still, carrying none of the unnatural rhythm I'd grown used to. It was as if the entire woods had shut its eyes the moment I crossed into daylight, retreating behind a curtain only it could see. I stood there shaking, waiting for the voices to surge out again, waiting for the thing I'd felt at my heels to step into view. But the silence remained absolute. Even the air felt reluctant to move, hovering cold and heavy around me like a held breath. Minutes passed before I realized how tightly I'd been gripping my pack straps. My fingers ached, stiff with adrenaline. Slowly, I forced myself to pull out my phone. A single bar of service flickered at the top of the screen, weak but steady. The first signal I'd had in days. For some reason, that tiny bar made the silence worse. It amplified the possibility that I had imagined everything, that the woods had been nothing but isolation and exhaustion, twisting themselves into hallucinations. I opened my pack to check the one thing that had stayed with me through all of it, the recorder. The red light on the device blinked steadily. It had never stopped running. I didn't press play. I couldn't, not with the forest still looming behind me like a closed door I had narrowly escaped through. Instead, I held the recorder in my palm and watched that blinking red light freeze the air around me in a new kind of dread. It meant the voices might be real. It meant I wasn't alone out there, not in the way I thought. And it meant whatever had whispered my name, whatever had kept pace with me in the dark, might have left something behind. Only when I heard a car creeping up the gravel road did the spell of silence break. A ranger truck, the first living presence I had seen since stepping onto the trail days earlier. I didn't wave it down. I didn't call out. I just stood there, clutching the recorder as if it were the only anchor holding me to the version of the world that made sense. The ranger nodded at me through the window, then drove on, leaving me with the faint smell of engine exhaust and the widening knowledge that I had crossed some invisible threshold the forest didn't want me to cross. For now, it stayed quiet. But the red light kept blinking, and I knew that whatever the recorder held wasn't going to give me comfort. It was going to answer questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. The rangers didn't say much when I returned to report what had happened. They asked routine questions, the kind meant for lost hikers or people who'd twisted an ankle. Where I camped, which route I took, whether I'd seen anyone else on the trail. I answered mechanically, still feeling the weight of the forest clinging to my clothes. When they drove back with me to check the campsite, the woods looked disappointingly normal. No broken branches, no strange footprints, no signs that anything had circled my tent for hours on end. The clearing felt smaller in daylight, almost harmless, the kind of place families might stop to eat lunch in the summer. The ranger crouched near the patch of ground where I remembered hearing voices slipping through the moss. He brushed his hand over the dirt and straightened, giving me a look that hovered somewhere between sympathy and caution. He didn't find anything. I already knew he wouldn't, but it was the recorder they lingered on. When I handed it over, the ranger asked if I wanted to listen together or hear it alone. I hesitated, then chose alone. Some part of me needed the truth to reach me first, before anyone else. I walked a short distance from the truck, sat on a fallen log, and pressed play. At first, I thought the recording was broken. The audio was thick with static, layered so heavily it sounded like wind rushing through a tunnel. But then the static shifted, shaping itself into cadence, into breath, into voices. Dozens of them. They rose and fell like waves crashing behind walls. Not quite words at first, just the muffled rhythm of people speaking from deep underground. As the minutes passed, some voices sharpened, pushing through the distortion. I heard pleading, thin, ragged begging from people I didn't recognize. I heard warnings whispered in trembling patterns, telling me to go back, to stop walking, to take another path while I still could. Some voices sounded as though they were choking on dirt. Some gasped like they'd been running for miles. A few repeated simple phrases over and over, caught in loops like broken recordings. Every one of them carried the same tone: fear. Not of me, but for me. I almost stopped the playback. Almost, but something in the static shifted again, pulling me deeper into the sound. The chaos of overlapping voices thinned for a moment. A single tone rose out of the noise, soft, steady, familiar enough that the hair on the back of my neck lifted. It spoke my name, not the clipped version strangers use, the full name. My full name, and it spoke it with my pacing, my breath pattern, my exact cadence. I froze, the recorder poised between my fingers as if dropping it might change the outcome. The voice didn't fade. It grew clearer, lifting itself out of the static until it sounded like someone standing right behind me. I tried to tell myself it was an echo, some bizarre acoustic effect captured by the device. But deep down, I knew better. I knew exactly how my own breath sounded when fear tightened my throat. I had heard it for days, and that was the breath the recording carried. The voice, my voice, began speaking in broken sentences, not warnings, not screams, something closer to pleading, as if it were calling from a place I hadn't reached yet, trying desperately to catch my attention before something else did. I listened, frozen, as the words tangled together through layers of distortion. Some phrases I recognized, some I didn't. And at the end, just before the recording cut off, a second version of my voice overlapped the first. Not identical, not aligned. The two tones clashed, like echoes fighting for the same space, saying the same thing in slightly different rhythms. The last sentence it forced out wasn't one I had ever spoken, but it sounded like something I might say if I was lost, terrified, and running out of options. Don't let me end up here. The recording clicked off. The forest around me stayed silent, and for a long time, I couldn't tell which version of myself that final voice belonged to, the one sitting on the log, or the one still wandering somewhere beneath the canopy, trying to find a way out. The night, the forest spoke. I reached the campground just as the sun bled away behind the canyon rim, leaving the air warm and still in that familiar desert hush. I built a small fire beside the van, listening to the canyon breathe as wind drifted through it in long, hollow sighs. For a while, the quiet felt peaceful, almost protective, until a faint glow appeared far across the canyon. Another fire, where there had been nothing but empty rock minutes before. I watched it cautiously, waiting to see someone move around it, but the figure seated beside the flames stayed perfectly motionless, unmoved by the cooling air or the shifting shadows. His shape didn't waver, didn't turn, didn't reach toward the heat. It took a slow, uneasy moment for me to realize he wasn't looking at the fire at all. Across that vast stretch of stone and darkness, he was staring straight at me, still as carved obsidian, as if the canyon itself had folded inward and carried him closer with every passing second. I kept pretending to focus on small camp chores, tightening a strap on the cooler, brushing sand from the van door, stirring the fire just to hear something familiar. But every few seconds, my eyes snapped back to the figure across the canyon. He hadn't shifted an inch since I first spotted him. Not a tilt of the shoulders, not the smallest adjustment against the desert cold that crept in once the sun fully died. The wind pushed dust across the ground in thin ribbons. Yet his silhouette never reacted, never braced, never even acknowledged the temperature dropping around us. Time began slipping strangely, losing its edges. Minutes felt stretched thin and brittle, while the fire on his side of the canyon burned in the exact same shape, frozen as if trapped in a photograph. When my phone screen showed midnight, the distant flame went out in a single, breathless instant. No dimming, no flicker, just gone. But the man didn't vanish with it. He remained perfectly outlined in the darkness, visible without any light at all, as though the night itself preferred him lit. Moonlight slid across the canyon in a pale wash, revealing the figure even though no fire remained to backlight him, as if the light bent itself just to keep him visible. I tried to reason with myself, whispering quiet explanations, maybe a trick of distance, maybe reflection off a rock face, maybe the exhaustion I'd been ignoring since morning, but none of it fit the way his shape held so sharply in the open dark. I forced myself to look away, just for a heartbeat, to calm the rising pulse in my throat. And when I glanced back, he was sitting closer, perched right at the cliff's edge with the same rigid posture, the same unbroken stare. The breath I drew tasted metallic, thin, as though the air itself didn't want me here. And I muttered under my breath that I must be sleepwalking through fear, seeing things because I wanted a reason to leave. Yet even from that new distance, he hadn't moved a single muscle. It felt impossible, wrong, like I was watching a pose held by something that didn't understand how living bodies shifted or breathed. The canyon fell into a suffocating quiet, a kind of silence that felt intentional. No insects, no wind, not even the soft settling of cooling stone, just a vast, listening stillness that made my own breaths sound intrusive. I lifted my phone with shaking hands and snapped a photo, desperate for proof that the figure was real, but the image only showed the faint outline of my fire. Nothing else, as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. When I lowered the phone, the world had rearranged itself. He was no longer across the canyon or perched on a cliff. He was sitting beside my fire pit, as if he had always been there, as if I had been the one unaware of how close he'd become. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, hot, and strangely electric. Then the fire cracked, a single sharp pop that echoed far too loudly, and in that jump of light, I realized he was only a few feet away, angled toward me, his face turned in a way that suggested staring, even though I couldn't make out any features at all. The space between us felt thin, fragile, as if the canyon hadn't closed after all. But I had. I stumbled backward from the fire and ran for the van, every step kicking up dry sand that felt too soft, too silent beneath my boots, as if the ground were trying to muffle my escape. My hands fumbled wildly with the keys, slipping against the metal, while my breath came in thin, panicked bursts. The engine struggled for a moment before catching, and as the tires rolled over the dust, I let out a shaky gasp of relief until I sensed a weight beside me. A shape sat in the passenger seat, facing forward with an unnatural stillness, its head slightly tilted as though listening for something beyond human hearing. The faint starlight caught in its eyes, if they were eyes, reflecting them like smooth glass marbles that held the entire canyon sky, without any hint of life or expression. Its face, too smooth and too featureless, reflected nothing back at all. My body moved before my thoughts did. I tore the door open and bolted into the open desert, stumbling through sagebrush and cold wind as the figure in the van began to turn its head. Slow enough to feel deliberate, slow enough to feel certain. I tore through the darkness between the rock formations, but the sound of my own footsteps felt strangely wrong, muted, swallowed, as if the canyon had grown tired of echoes and decided to keep every noise for itself. My breath rasped in my chest, yet even that seemed dampened, like I was running underwater. Whenever I forced myself to look back, the figure waited somewhere new, perched atop a boulder with its knees drawn up, or settled neatly in the dry creek bed, as though it had always belonged there, or sitting just beyond the crooked limbs of a juniper tree. It never rose, never walked, never even shifted its weight. But each time, the distance between us closed without explanation, as if I were running toward it instead of away. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam thinning to a sickly thread, before sputtering out completely, leaving me in a darkness so total it felt physical, pressing against my skin and filling my mouth with the taste of cold stone. I stood frozen in that thick black, unable to see more than the faint shape of my own hands, terrified of the moment the next glance back would reveal the figure sitting only an arm's length away. The desert seemed to bend around me in quiet, looping patterns, as if the ground had forgotten where anything truly was. Every set of tracks I found, my own, circled back into stone or vanished into smooth dust, as though I'd been walking in the same tightening spiral all night. Small flickers of ember light appeared across the canyon floor, scattered like distant campfires trying to pulse through the dark, and each time I glanced from one to another, the previous one winked out, leaving only the after-image burning behind my eyes. My sense of time thinned to nothing. The night felt stretched, emptied, endless, with no hint of where the moon should have been. A final glow swelled behind me, a warm push of heat brushing the back of my neck. Too close, too sudden, as if a fire had ignited right where I stood. I didn't dare move. The warmth intensified for a breath, then collapsed into cold, leaving only a heavy, suffocating silence. In that hollow space, I felt the undeniable pressure of someone seated inches behind me, as if the desert itself had paused to listen while something waited to be noticed. By the time dawn finally lifted over the canyon, the campsite stood empty, the van doors hanging open as if someone had slipped out in a hurry and never found their way back. The fire pit had gone cold, a circle of grey ash untouched by wind, and the sleeping bag lay unzipped and hollow, holding nothing but the pale morning light. Rangers later traced the footprints looping through the desert, but the tracks only circled, spiraled, and eventually faded into bare stone, as though the ground refused to record anything past a certain point. Across the canyon, where my own fire had burned the first night, a new glow rose with the sun, a fire burning steady and bright, too early and too sharp to be natural. Beside it sat a man, perfectly still, his posture stiff and unwavering, glassy eyes fixed on whoever dared look back across the distance. And though the morning wind swept dust between us, he never blinked, never shifted, never hinted at warmth or breath. He simply watched, waiting as if the canyon had chosen a new figure to sit. The long night out, and I was the only one who remembered why. The path that looped backward. The sisters had laughed as they tightened the straps on their packs, joking about how easy the 6-mile loop would be, how well marked and predictable the trail seemed. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappled and warm, and birds called overhead in familiar, soothing patterns. Every step felt ordinary, familiar, like the forest was nothing more than a backdrop for their reunion. But as they rounded the first bend, past a mossy log, a strange sensation pricked at the back of their minds. The log looked identical. The same twisted branch, the same dark groove worn into the bark, as if they had passed it moments before. They shrugged it off, blaming tiredness or déjà vu, and consulted the map. The path still made sense, but the unease persisted. A few minutes later, one of them froze. There, pressed into the dirt, were boot prints. Their own, facing the opposite direction. The forest, once inviting, felt suddenly watchful. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, echoed too deliberately. They had entered the loop, thinking it would be simple, but the trail had already begun to betray them, turning familiarity into a creeping, impossible uncertainty. They tried to turn back, retracing their steps toward the main trailhead, but the path betrayed them in ways they couldn't understand. The familiar markers, the yellow paint stripes on trees, the carved numbers on wooden posts, began to repeat, appearing over and over as if the trail were folding in on itself. Every marker looked identical, down to the chips and cracks in the bark, and the sisters felt the forest shrinking around them, closing in, suffocating. Their GPS froze, the tiny screen blinking blank as the compass needle spun violently, refusing to settle, mocking their attempts to navigate. Shadows stretched long before sunset, and the light dimmed unnaturally early, casting the forest in a strange, cold haze. Each step forward led them back to the same exact bend, the same familiar log, the same crooked route jutting into the path. The trees seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting. Panic prickled their skin as the forest transformed from a safe, sunlit loop into a labyrinth designed to trap them. They were moving, but they weren't progressing. Every turn, every familiar landmark, whispered the same cruel truth. The trail was no longer theirs to control. As dusk settled over the loop, the sisters felt the first prickling of true fear. From deeper in the woods, faint voices began to rise, soft, fragmented, impossibly familiar. They called their names, whispering in tones only they would recognize, echoing the laughter and secrets of childhood. Songs they had sung together in secret forts, promises whispered long ago, memories no one else could know, now repeated by the shadows themselves. Every time they tried to move together, the voices split, coming from different directions, tugging at them in ways that made their hearts pound. The forest darkened unnaturally, the air growing heavy, thick with the smell of damp leaves and cold earth. One sister, desperate to locate the source, stepped off the trail for a moment, crouching to peer into a dense copse of trees, and vanished without a sound. The remaining sister called out, her voice swallowed immediately by the whispering woods, leaving only the echo of her own panic. The path that had once seemed so familiar was gone, replaced by trees that shifted imperceptibly, rearranging themselves around her, as if the forest itself were alive and intent on keeping them trapped forever. She ran, circling the forest again and again, her throat raw, lungs burning. But the trail refused to break open. Every stump, every rock, every twisted root she swore she hadn't passed before reappeared beneath her boots, now stamped with two sets of footprints. The ones she recognized and another that belonged to her missing sister. The trees seemed to lean closer with each pass, their shadows stretching and folding over the same 6 miles like a cruel echo, Hours bled into one another, and the sun barely pierced the canopy, leaving her in a dim, unnatural gloom. Just before dawn, the endless loop shifted suddenly, a clearing appearing that felt painfully familiar. In the soft dirt, she found her sister's backpack, neatly placed where hers should have been, untouched and impossibly precise. Her heart sank as the reality set in. She had escaped somehow, but the forest had not released the other. The wind whispered faintly through the trees, carrying a sound she could not identify. Laughter, perhaps, or the faint rustle of movement behind the trunks. The loop had bent for her, but the trail itself seemed to hum with a terrible patience, waiting for the next step. She walked out of the forest alone, each step heavy with disbelief, haunted by the feeling that the trail had somehow chosen to let her go. Search teams combed the loop for weeks, finding no trace of her sister, only overlapping prints that twisted and doubled back in impossible patterns, like the forest itself was mocking logic. Nights were worse than days. She couldn't escape the memory of the whispering voices, the trail markers repeating endlessly, the eerie perfection of the loop that refused to end. Weeks later, hikers passing the same 6 miles reported seeing two women hand in hand, moving slowly along the path, smiling without speaking. They always looked the same, unchanged, as if time had trapped them there. Even now she could picture the scene, the impossible calm of their faces, the way the sunlight flickered through the leaves as if highlighting them for an audience of trees that never forgot. The trail had claimed its sister, leaving her with only the memory and the knowledge that somewhere in those woods the loop continued to run, patient, silent, and waiting for the next pair to step inside. The sleeping bag, outside my tent. They arrived at the clearing as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the kind of quiet golden light that makes a forest feel both alive and empty at once. 4 friends, laughing softly, unpacked their gear and built a small fire in the center of the site. Everything felt familiar. The smell of dry pine needles, the scratch of twigs underfoot, the way smoke curled lazily upward. But there was a stillness that didn't belong, a pause in the usual hum of insects and distant birds. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving the clearing strangely inert, like it was holding its breath for something. As they shared stories and pushed back the night with the warmth of the fire, Dylan stepped away, muttering something about needing a moment to himself. He disappeared past the tree line without a flashlight, leaving the circle incomplete, the shadows stretching into the woods. For a while, the group barely noticed, wrapped up in the comfort of shared company. Then movement brushed against the undergrowth, subtle, deliberate, too precise to be random. A branch snapped, once, twice, and then nothing. The night pressed closer, dense and expectant, as if the forest were watching him disappear. The fire crackled, but its warmth felt thin. The shadows beyond the light flickered, carrying shapes that didn't belong, shifting at the corner of vision. For the first time that night, the narrator felt the forest breathing, not in wind, not in rustle, but in a slow, deliberate inhalation, a presence curling between the trees, just beyond reach. Dylan's absence no longer seemed casual. Something else was there, something that moved without noise, waiting just beyond the firelight. They didn't see it yet, they didn't hear it clearly, but the stillness, the unnatural pause of the forest, carried the unshakable certainty that the woods had already begun to close around them, and the dark would not be empty. The others drifted off to sleep one by one, their snores and quiet breaths fading into the dark as the narrator lay awake in his tent. The forest beyond the nylon seemed to swell in the absence of sound, its stillness deepening into something heavier, almost alive. Then it began. A dragging sound across the pine needles, slow, deliberate, impossible to mistake for wind or animal. Each scrape against the forest floor carried weight, stopping abruptly just outside the tent, as if whatever moved had known exactly where he lay. He froze, ears straining, every hair on his neck standing. The dragging shifted once, and then a shape settled at the tent flap. A sleeping bag, fully zipped, had been placed there with unnatural precision. It didn't roll or flop. It sat upright, firm, as though held from within. From inside, a slow, deep breathing pulsed, deliberate and measured, almost intentional, syncing unnervingly with his own heartbeat. It was patient, aware, waiting, and yet somehow impossible to locate. The tent walls shivered slightly, as if acknowledging the presence, a thin vibration tracing the canvas. No one responded when he whispered, calling out into the dark. The forest swallowed his words whole, leaving nothing but the rhythm of the breathing and the subtle scrape of pine needles as the only proof that something was there. He couldn't see inside the bag, couldn't tell its size or shape beyond what the dim tent light hinted at, but he knew it was alive in some way he couldn't define. His own pulse roared in his ears, a frantic counterpoint to the calm, methodical breaths that refused to stop. The night stretched endlessly, the sleeping bag pressed against the edge of his tent like a patient watcher. He stayed motionless, unsure whether to confront it or remain frozen, knowing that either choice could change the rest of the night or the rest of his life. He called for them, his voice cracking as it sliced through the stillness of the night, but the forest swallowed every word. The trees stood motionless, their shadows stretching like dark fingers into the clearing, and the fire from the main circle had burned down to embers that offered no comfort. The breathing inside the bag grew louder, almost expectant, pulsing with a rhythm that felt like it was waiting for him to act. Every inhale seemed to press against the nylon, warm and slow, heavy with intent. Hands shaking, he reached for the zipper, dragging it slowly down. The moment it split open, heat rolled out from the bag, soft, tangible, unsettling. But the interior was empty. No Dylan, no shape, just flattened fabric and the eerie warmth of something that had occupied it moments before. The empty space pressed against him with its absence, a weight that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He stumbled backward, heart hammering, searching the darkened clearing with his headlamp, but the light revealed nothing. The air smelled faintly of pine and earth, yet there was something metallic beneath it, subtle, sour, impossible to place. Then a twig snapped behind him. He spun, but nothing stood there. The forest beyond the firelight seemed to lean in closer, every shadow shifting unnaturally, echoing the presence that had just left him. The sleeping bag lay still again, zipped, patient, waiting as though it had merely paused. Every nerve in his body screamed that whatever was outside the tent wasn't done, and the forest's silence pressed in, dense and alive, holding its breath, as he tried to steady himself. The night stretched on, unbroken, and he realized the emptiness wasn't a reprieve. It was the beginning. Morning came slow, pale light spilling through the trees, but it brought no comfort. Dylan was still gone. His tent remained untouched, the flap neatly zipped, his shoes tucked beside the sleeping pad, keys resting in perfect order. Nothing suggested he had ever left. The pine needles on the ground were unbroken, smooth as if the forest itself had swallowed every step he took. No footprints led away from the campsite, no scuffed bark, no disturbed soil, just an impossible stillness that pressed against their ears and chests. They searched the perimeter carefully, every glance down the faint trails, every crunch of the pine needles underfoot met with silence. The woods seemed to lean closer as they moved, as though curious about the search. And then the narrator noticed it, a single pine needle lodged in the sleeping bag. Tiny, out of place, impossibly deliberate. It shouldn't have been there. It didn't belong. It was a small, precise reminder that whatever had claimed Dylan had marked its presence, a signature in the emptiness. The group exchanged uneasy looks, but words felt inadequate, even absurd. The forest wasn't just quiet. It was calculating, watching, waiting. Every step they took seemed echoed by unseen movement. Every glance behind revealed only shadows, but shadows that felt patient, deliberate, and hungry. Dylan's absence was no longer a mystery. It was a message, and the forest had just begun to write it. They didn't know how much longer they could stay, or what might appear next. Night came again, faster than they expected, the air heavy and thick as if the forest itself had exhaled in anticipation. The group had reported Dylan missing, but no help had arrived yet, and the dark pressed in closer, carrying that same unnatural stillness. The narrator returned to his tent, dreading what he might find, and there it was, waiting. The sleeping bag, fully zipped, positioned with that impossible precision right outside the flap. It seemed to hum with life, warm to the touch, and yet utterly inhuman. The breathing inside had changed. It was quicker now, more deliberate, more human in its cadence, as if it were mimicking panic or dread. Each inhale pressed against the tent, vibrating the nylon slightly, a slow, methodical pulse that felt like a heartbeat, not its own. The narrator froze, hands hovering over the canvas, unsure whether to touch it or retreat. When he finally did, the instant his fingers brushed the smooth surface, the breathing ceased, cut off abruptly, leaving the night hollow and silent once more. The absence of sound felt heavier than the presence, an oppressive void that weighed against his chest and made it impossible to think clearly. The darkness around him seemed to lean in closer, shadows, stretching and shifting at impossible angles. Every instinct screamed that this was not just a prank, not just a trick of the wind or the forest. Something had learned, had adapted, had claimed a rhythm of its own, and it was waiting to see what he would do next. The sleeping bag remained perfectly still, patient, a promise that it would return, and that when it did, nothing about the night would be ordinary again. He pulled the tent flap closed slowly, each second stretching unbearably, and lay awake, listening to the quiet that was louder than any sound. Days passed after returning home, but the forest hadn't stayed behind. The city felt too bright, too ordinary, yet the memories clung like cold shadows to every corner of his apartment. For a while, he tried to convince himself it had ended, that Dylan's disappearance and the breathing bag belonged only to the woods, that no forest followed him here. But then it began again. The sleeping bag appeared at his doorway, always zipped, always full, as if it had stepped from the night itself into his living space without effort. He could feel it shifting subtly, the weight inside, adjusting its orientation, almost like it was watching him, learning how he moved, predicting which way he would turn. Nights stretched long, the silence around the apartment thick with anticipation, broken only by the occasional whisper of the bag settling on the floor. One evening, the impossible happened. A voice came from within the bag. Dylan's voice, faint and trembling, asked him to unzip it. It was impossibly wrong, carried across distance and circumstance, yet unmistakable. The warmth rolled out from the nylon, and with it came the unmistakable scent of pine, metallic and alive, dragging the forest into his home. Every instinct screamed to leave, to throw the bag out, to run. But the presence was patient. It didn't hurry. It waited for him to act, to acknowledge it, as though teaching him that the boundaries of safety had shifted, that the rules of the forest no longer applied. Sleep became impossible. The apartment walls felt like branches, stretching and bending, listening, and the bag remained, breathing in time with him, never fully revealed, never fully absent. He realized then that leaving would not matter. Distance was meaningless. It had learned how to follow, and it would not stop. He finally opened the sleeping bag, without hesitation, letting the darkness inside spill across the floor like a cold, tangible shadow. Warm air rolled out with it, carrying the scent of pine and a sharp metallic tang that made his stomach tighten. For a moment, he convinced himself it was empty, that perhaps confronting it would end the cycle. But then he felt it, the subtle weight shifting beside him, the unmistakable presence of another. A second, the sleeping bag dragged itself silently across the room, stopping beside the first as if drawn by some unspoken command. The bags began to breathe together, synchronized in a slow, deliberate rhythm that pressed against the edges of reality. The sound was almost human, almost patient, almost intelligent, but nothing visible moved within them. The room grew colder, the darkness thicker, and he realized the air itself was watching, breathing in tandem with the bags. Then the bedroom door, which had been closed moments before, moved slowly on its own, closing just enough to frame the two shapes, as if the room itself was sealing him in. The floor creaked under weight he could not see. Shadows pulled and shifted with intent. Every instinct screamed that he was no longer in control, that whatever had claimed Dylan had expanded its reach. And now it had learned to step beyond the forest into his home. He stood frozen, trapped between curiosity and terror, knowing that this was no longer just a nightmare. The bags breathed, the room moved, and the darkness, patient and alive, had finally found its mark. The silent campsite. She returned to the mountain path her brother had died on, the trail curling up in quiet switchbacks beneath the fading sun. The air smelled cold, sharp with a scent of stone and damp pine, and a draft rose from the ravine that made her jacket cling to her shoulders. Each step over loose gravel and worn roots carried the memory of him, his laughter at wrong turns, his careful attention to cairns, the way he'd always urge her forward. The mountain seemed ordinary at first, familiar in the way mountains are to someone who had hiked them before, but the deeper she climbed, the more the quiet pressed against her. A syllable drifted up with the wind, faint, almost a name, almost hers. She paused, mid-step, heart catching. Her brother's absence had left an ache in the air she could almost touch, and now the mountain seemed to echo something that wasn't entirely wind. Every rock, every bend in the trail felt layered with memory, as if the path itself remembered the last time he had been here, and her steps now stirred that memory awake. As she reached the second switchback, the faint sound crystallized. It was a voice, soft but unmistakable, drifting from somewhere below the ridge. Her name, not shouted, not carried by the wind, like the syllable before, but clear in its rising lilt. The same cadence he had always used when calling her to hurry. Her breath caught. She told herself it was the forest, an echo, the trick of the light, and the slope, but instinct knotted her stomach. The trail felt both familiar and alien, each step weighted with expectation, each shadow a memory stretched too thin. She froze, listening as the voice fell silent between calls, the forest holding its breath in that tense pause. When it came again, it had shifted position, somewhere further down the trail, impossible to see, impossible to trace. Her pace quickened despite herself, pulled by the same invisible tug that had always drawn her toward him. She moved onward, aware of every leaf brushing underfoot, every rock tilting beneath her boot, every rustle of distant wildlife that seemed to startle at the edges of her perception. The trail was hers, yet the mountain felt alive in a way she could not name. And she realized that the quiet had begun to listen back. She stopped, letting the wind brush past her ears, and listened. At first, she tried to convince herself it was nothing, just the trail carrying sounds unevenly, stones scraping under a loose branch, the mountain sighing as it always did before dusk. But the voice came again, clearer this time. Her name, carried up from below, shaped in the same rising lilt her brother had used when calling her to hurry. Her stomach tightened. It wasn't playful this time, not the teasing tone of memory. It had weight. It had intent. The forest seemed to hush with every pause, as if it were holding its breath between the syllables. She tilted her head, scanning the shadows under the trees, watching the light fade over moss and rocks, feeling the uncanny stillness press in. Each time she thought the voice had vanished, it moved, sliding along the trail without footsteps, a sound without source, a presence without form. Her pace quickened despite herself, pulling her forward in a mix of dread and compulsion, her eyes straining to catch some familiar shape in the thinning light. Every bend, every fallen log, every overhang of stone began to feel layered with anticipation. The trail that had seemed ordinary now felt as if it were shifting subtly beneath her. She caught the whisper of dry leaves sliding against one another, faint and too deliberate, like tiny signals marking her path. Her breath came faster, mixing with the cold air, as though the forest itself had learned the rhythm of her heartbeat and was matching it. The voice called once more, impossibly close now, and she realized that something in the mountain was aware of her, watching and waiting. For the moment she reached out to answer. She reached the overlook and froze, scanning the lower trail, looping far beneath the ridge. The fading light smudged the outlines of trees and rocks, turning everything into a blur of shadow and violet haze. But the gesture was unmistakable. A figure stood exactly where the path bent, waving both arms in the precise way her brother had always signaled her to hurry. Her heart skipped, a mix of relief and disbelief, and for a moment she thought he had somehow returned, or that memory itself had stepped forward into the dimming world. The figure remained still, holding of the gesture, and the air seemed to vibrate around it. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The gesture was perfect, but the space around the figure carried an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself had conspired to leave it isolated, framed in shadow and silence. Her gaze flicked from the figure to the surrounding trees, expecting movement, expecting another sign, but nothing stirred. The wind whispered against her jacket, carrying a faint metallic scent, the kind of cold tang that makes the hairs on your arms bristle. Then, slowly, the figure stopped waving and pointed, not at the trail beneath, not at the path behind, but toward the switchbacks below, the trail she had yet to descend. The movement was deliberate, measured, impossible to ignore. She swallowed hard, knowing she was being lured deeper into the mountain, yet unable to resist. Every step forward was weighted with memory and expectation, as though the trail had folded time around her, linking the past and present into a single uneasy path. And even as she started down, she could feel it. Eyes that weren't eyes, watching, waiting, following her progress with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. She started down the switchbacks, each step crunching on loose gravel, the trail steep and winding beneath her boots. Every echo of her footfall sounded too deliberate, too close, as if someone or something was matching her pace just behind her. The fading light caught the edges of moss-covered stones, turning ordinary shapes into possible faces, and she felt the weight of the forest pressing in around her, thick with shadow and expectation. The mountain seemed to fold in on itself, the trail elongating, twisting, reshaping with every cautious step she took. The voice returned, appearing at odd intervals, never following any pattern she could predict. Sometimes it drifted ahead, calling from places she hadn't reached yet. Sometimes it lagged behind, just out of reach, stretching the sound in the thin air. It carried the familiar lilt. She knew, but something in the tone had changed. Sharper, more urgent, almost impatient. Her pulse quickened with each repetition, every syllable dragging her deeper into a panic she tried to suppress. A soft metallic click echoed from the trees, a single precise sound, like a camera shutter hidden somewhere among the branches. She froze, scanning the shadows, and the hairs on her arms rose. No movement followed the sound, but the presence was there, tangible in the way the air shifted, in the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The figure she had seen from the overlook had vanished, leaving only the trail, the wind, and the unseen observer somewhere in the dusk. Each step she took seemed both necessary and forbidden, pulling her toward the bottom of the mountain and deeper into a quiet she could feel, pressing against her chest. By the time she reached the lower trail, the figure was gone entirely, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the metallic tang of something she couldn't name. Her hands shook slightly, and she could feel the forest waiting for her next move, patient and unyielding. She pressed onward, unable to tell whether she was following a memory, a ghost, or some signal the mountain itself had set for her to discover. The path opened onto the lower trail, empty and silent, but something caught her eye immediately. A backpack, leaning against an old cedar, set as if someone had just put it down moments before. Her breath hitched, the hair on her arms standing on end. She knew that pack. The frayed strap, the faded fabric, the small marks where he had meant to fix it years ago. It was unmistakably hers brother's. She stepped closer, each footfall measured, every sense straining for movement in the trees. A rustle sounded behind the cedar, quick, deliberate, sharp, like someone shifting just out of sight. But when she swung her gaze, there was nothing. The forest held itself still, refusing to give up its secrets. Her fingers brushed the zipper, hesitating, and when she opened the pack, her breath caught again. Inside, everything was preserved perfectly. Notebooks, a water bottle, a hat folded neatly. No dust, no decay, no sign of time passing at all. It was as if it had been packed yesterday, or perhaps it had never been left there at all. The quiet pressed against her ears, making the distance between herself and the surrounding shadows feel measured, deliberate. She could feel the trail holding its breath, waiting for her to uncover the next piece, to step further into what she no longer understood. The forest was patient, patient as the memory of him pressed into every leaf, every stone, every branch that had guided her down the switchbacks. And somewhere in the rustle of distant branches, she could swear a voice, soft, familiar, was watching her next move. She knelt at the base of the cedar and lifted his old camera from the pack, cold and heavy in her hands, like river stone. The lens caught the last light of dusk, dull and grey, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to peer inside or put it back and run. Slowly, almost reverently, she scrolled through the images stored within. The first photos were familiar, a trail she had hiked with friends years ago, snapshots of rocks, trees, and the path winding endlessly beneath the sun. But the last image froze her entirely. It was them, both of them, standing together on this very trail, in the same jacket she was wearing now, as if she had been there to take the photo herself. Her fingers trembled as she checked the timestamp in the corner. Tomorrow. The date hadn't happened yet. Her heart slammed, and the hair along her neck lifted with the cold brush of impossibility. She had not taken any photos today. No one had. And yet, the image stared back at her, perfectly composed, perfectly timed, as if reality itself had bent to capture something she could not yet understand. The forest around her grew still, the shadows deepening with the last stretch of daylight. Every rustle sounded amplified, every branch and stone suddenly heavy with attention. The wind whispered in patterns she couldn't name, carrying faint syllables that almost sounded like her brother's voice, almost warning her, almost urging her forward. Her breath caught in her chest as the impossible weight of the photo pressed down. She had no answers, only questions, and an instinctive sense that the trail had not yet given up its secrets. A voice drifted up from the ravine again, louder now, sharper, brushing against her ear like breath on skin. It was not memory this time. It was present, immediate, and unmistakably him, or at least the way he sounded. The forest fell completely still around her, each branch and leaf frozen in place, as if it were holding its own breath to hear what she would do next. The shadows lengthened and thickened, turning familiar shapes into something unfamiliar, something deliberate. Something moved behind the cedar, slow, familiar, waiting. She could sense it before she saw it. A presence calibrated to her pace, matching her hesitations, testing the boundaries of her courage. Every instinct screamed to step back, to run, but her feet remained planted. The voice called again, this time carrying the weight of expectation, the subtle cadence of someone urging her closer, pulling her forward, despite the chill rising in her spine. As darkness settled over the trail, the voice spoke her name one last time. It was close enough to make her start, close enough to feel as though he was standing right beside her, though the shadows revealed nothing. She stood frozen, the forest around her listening as the air thickened, each second stretching into unbearable anticipation. The path, behind and before her, seemed to merge. The the switchbacks folding into themselves, leaving her suspended between memory, reality, and something she could not yet comprehend. The last syllable lingered in the cold air, echoing faintly through the trees, and then silence fell, absolute, patient, waiting. I heard my brother on the trail. The swamp settled around us with a slow, heavy calm as my son and I set up camp beside the still water, fireflies drifting lazily between the cypress trunks like sparks trapped in syrup. The air hung thick and warm, carrying the soft buzz of insects and the distant plunk of something slipping beneath the surface. All so ordinary, it felt safe enough to ignore how the water beside us barely moved at all, as if holding its breath. Sometime deep in the night, a thump hit the cooler hard enough to shake the tent wall, snapping me awake in a sweat. For a moment, I thought it was a fallen branch, or maybe a raccoon searching for scraps. But the sound had weight, too much weight for anything that should have been out there. We stepped into the humid dark, with our flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam catching motes of moisture suspended in the air, and that was when we saw it. A single muddy handprint smeared across the cooler lid, far too wide and far too long, the fingers splayed in a way that made my stomach tighten. Each groove pressed deep enough to show strength that didn't belong to any animal we knew. The swamp stayed silent around us, as if it had been watching the whole time. Morning brought a fragile calm that felt almost like a lie. We told ourselves it had been an animal, though no tracks led to or from the cooler, no claw marks or paw prints marred the mud. The swamp seemed to hold its breath as evening crept back in, the usual chorus of frogs and insects strangely muted, each silence twisting tighter around my chest. Hours after dark, I found the cooler open, its contents stripped clean with a precision that was impossible, as if someone or something knew exactly how to remove food without disturbing a single container. Several new handprints marred the plastic, spaced and pressed down repeatedly, testing the weight, testing the lid, leaving an impression that suggested curiosity more than hunger, intelligence more than instinct. The night pressed in around us, thick with humidity, and something watching, and every rustle of leaves or drip of water sounded like a signal, like a reminder that we weren't alone, and that whatever it was, it had been here long before we arrived. That night, I kept a small lantern burning, the soft yellow glow trembling across the inside of the tent, while my son shifted restlessly beside me, too restless to sleep and too quiet to speak. Hours passed, heavy and slow, until a low, wet breathing began circling outside, vibrating through the ground like a slow, deliberate drumbeat that made my chest tighten with every pulse. The air shifted around us, thick and humid, carrying the metallic tang of mud and decay, and I caught glimpses of movement too tall, too broad, too deliberate to be any swamp creature I knew. My son whispered, voice tight and trembling, that something had risen from the water, standing upright beside the dark shapes of the cypress trunks, and I couldn't tell if my own fear was making the shadows stretch taller, or if something truly impossible loomed just beyond the thin canvas, listening to our every breath. I inched the tent, zipper open just enough to see a sliver of the swamp outside, and there it stood, a towering shape, arms hanging low, head tilted as if listening, utterly still and impossibly large, mud dripping from its elbows in long, deliberate streaks that pointed toward the tent. The humid night pressed in around us, thick with the scent of water and decay, and every breath I took felt loud, almost obscene. in the unnatural silence. Its chest rose and fell slowly, methodically, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the soft mud beneath my feet, each inhalation carrying a weight that made the canvas of the tent seem paper-thin. I held my son closer, feeling the tremor in his small frame. As the thing waited, watching, listening, the darkness around it, alive with intent, leaving the world outside the tent flattened, compressed, and uncomfortably close. We stayed frozen until the breathing faded, the swamp holding its hush, like a living thing that didn't want us to move, waiting for any hint of dawn that seemed reluctant to arrive. Ripples moved against the still water, curling in impossible circles around the tent, as if traced by a slow, deliberate finger, and the mud along the edge whispered under something heavy brushing past it. My heart slammed as I glimpsed a shape, moving between the cypress trunks, carrying the cooler with no visible effort, as if its strength didn't belong to a human body. Every sense screamed at me to run, but the air was thick, wet, and still, and the ground beneath my feet vibrated with the quiet certainty that whatever held the cooler had been here all along, waiting for us to notice. Morning finally broke, the sunlight struggling through thick fog that draped the swamp in a pale, hesitant glow, and there it was, the cooler, placed deliberately in the center of camp as if arranged for us to see. Every inch of its surface was covered in muddy handprints, layered on top of one another like overlapping messages, each smear telling a story I couldn't read, each ridge pressed deep enough to make me wonder what strength had made them. I lifted the lid, and inside, beneath melting ice, sat a single shoe that wasn't ours, still warm as though it had been taken only moments before, and the smell of wet mud clung to it in a way that made my stomach turn. The swamp itself seemed to tighten around us, silent except for the occasional drip of water from the cypress leaves, and for the first time I realized that whatever had come to our camp had left something in its place, something human, something impossibly close, and something we weren't meant to touch. We packed in silence, moving quickly but carefully, every sense straining against the thick, humid air, watching the tree line as if expecting some shape to tilt ahead from behind a trunk, to break the fragile barrier between swamp and camp. No tracks led away from the site, only deep impressions in the mud, where something heavy had stood for a long time, pressed so firmly it seemed almost carved into the earth. Across the water, bubbles rose in a slow, spiraling pattern, breaking the mirror-like surface, and then stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving a stillness heavier than the fog. As we drove away, the hum of the engine masking the swamp's quiet. My son pointed to the tailgate and froze. Muddy handprints faced inward, pressed there after we had already left, as if something had followed us in silence and wanted us to notice, wanted us to remember what the swamp kept hidden.